Ron Nate, how are you, sir?
I'm just great, Matthew. Great to be here.
Great to have you
on
here.
Your show.
Do you want me to call you Professor Ron Nate? I don't know what to say these days.
Just call me Ron. You know, people want to call me professor or doctor. It puts expectations out there.
Well,
I don't need those.
No expectations here. We're gonna be all right. You are the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation.
Correct.
And as embarrassing as this is, it took me a while to understand what the IFF really was. And at its core, the IFF is a lens. It's the ability to have an organization that looks at legislation and actions by the Idaho government and runs them through a set of essentially principles and lenses saying, you know, limited government or big government, a freedom, less freedom, and comes up with a rating score saying like, okay, this is a positive thing for our principle set, and this is a negative thing for our principle set, and helps people understand the nuances of, okay, at a glance, this is a good thing essentially, or this is a less good thing, or this is a bad thing. That's essentially what.
Well, sure. The Freedom Foundation overall, we are, people like to use the word think tank. We're an activist tank. And you would think that a red state like Idaho, conservative red state, Republican, doesn't need something like an Idaho Freedom Foundation to keep them in line. But I would say that it's absolutely essential here. Even though our legislature is predominantly Republican, our voting populace predominantly Republican, it doesn't mean our government and policies match up with that. So our mission at the Idaho Freedom Foundation is to promote the ideals that the American founders promoted, to fight Marxism at all levels, to promote liberty, freedom, limited government, restrained government spending so that all Idahoans can prosper. That's what we do. A big part of that is what you mentioned, and that is accountability for our government officials. And so instead of just saying, hey, the legislators aren't being conservative enough, you know, the policies don't match up well with what Idaho wants, we developed a system for evaluating our legislators. And basically it comes down to this. We outlined 14 freedom principles. Growing government, shrinking government, spending more, spending less. Is it constitutional? Is it not? Does it make something public that used to be private or vice versa? And we come up with all these metrics and we rate each bill on those metrics. You'll have some bills that are a +3, some that are -2. The worst bills are like -6 or 7. And then legislators grade themselves based on how they vote on all the bills. We rated 350 bills last year. And legislators vote on those, and whatever score they get versus what is possible determines their percentage. And we have a group of A legislators. We have a lot of F legislators. And you'd be surprised how many Republicans who got elected as Republicans score as F-rated legislators on our Freedom Index. And that means they voted against liberty. They voted for big government. They voted for big spending a lot. They might argue with one bill rating here or there, but they were graded on 350 of them.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I keep wondering about with this is which version of freedom does the IFF lean towards? And what I mean by this is, because it seems this is a question that I keep I'm trying to iron it out, because there are a lot of people that would articulate that San Francisco has a level of freedom that Idaho does not enjoy. Let's just take, for instance, cannabis, right? Like you want to smoke marijuana in San Francisco, either through legislation or through lack of functional policing, you're going to be able to. You just walk down the street, no problem. You want to do hard drugs in San Francisco? A lot of people do, and I don't see a lot of people getting arrested. So you have that freedom, which you enjoy in, say, like Portland or Seattle in similar manners. But you also have a different type of freedom here, which is more of, hey, we have freedom. We enjoy freedom free of, crime and things of this nature. We're going to engage with law enforcement more strictly, and we are free to draw with inside the lines we all agree to. Now, some people, I actually saw an article that got published recently that rated, I think, Wyoming, Texas, and Idaho as the least free places in America. And again, that got me thinking on this, which is, look, which version of freedom do we have here? So like in your mind, which version of freedom do we subscribe to, or does the IFF perpetuate?
Well, we haven't seen those debates in Idaho. We've seen Colorado go pro-marijuana. We've seen it in California. We've also seen the massive destruction and degradation of society that comes with it. I don't see anytime soon a bill going through the House or Senate that says, let's legalize marijuana all across the state. I see Reclaim Idaho maybe wanting to do a proposition that way. And then it'll be put directly to the voters if Reclaim Idaho got their way. But right now, our work at the Idaho Freedom Foundation is promoting liberty in the sense that let's get government off our back. Let's stop the regulations. You know, when COVID comes around, let's not close the businesses and the churches and leave the state liquor stores open. Let's let private industry work and let government worry about its own self. Let's reduce the tax burdens on Idahoans. Idaho is one of only 4 states that fully taxes groceries. We have a lot of freedom battles to fight before we get down to those areas of whether or not stoners can be smoking in downtown Boise or not.
Okay, got it. Understood. Glad we're far away from that. But let's come back to liberty then. You're saying like you want to promote liberty. What does that mean? Because like personal freedom, right? Personal freedom can be, you know, a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. And I find that in more conservative leaning states, personal liberty is a very hard definition of restrictions, right? Instead of liberty that some people perpetuate, which is no restrictions, right? Which version are we going? Because if we're like, hey, we want the liberty that has very hard edge restrictions on what people can do, some people argue, well, that's not really liberty. It's like, well, it's liberty within the you know, etch-a-sketch that we're looking for. So like, which is it, right? Because I find that a lot of people that were touting the idea of personal autonomy and liberty and freedom paved the way for the problems in some of our surrounding states.
Mm-hmm. Well, the default should be the constitutional default. And if you look at the federal constitution, people view that as a restriction on what I can do to my neighbor or whatnot, but that's not it at all. If you're a scholar of the U.S. Constitution, you'll know that it is a limitation on what government can do. It gives the federal government, depending on how you read it, 17 to 23 enumerated powers, beyond which it cannot go. And that is restricting government liberates people. Keeping government from infringing on your rights liberates people. And I give this analogy when I teach the Constitution is that if I went away for the weekend and left my 4 kids at home and said, you know, and I tried to come up with a list of all the things you can't do, I can come up with quite a list. You can't do this, can't do X, Y, Z. So, but my kids are very creative. They can think of a lot more things to do that gets them in trouble than I could possibly list. But what is more restrictive to my kids is giving them a short list of the things they can do. And if it's not on the list, they can't do it. And that's what we've done to our federal government. We've given them a very short list of the things they can do. And that's very restrictive on our government, but very liberating on us as a people. And so I want to protect individual rights. First of all, the rights to own your property. If you can't own your property, you can't be the pilot of your own destiny anymore because you start to become prosperous, the government wants to take it. And that's what we see in command dictatorships.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
What does own your own property mean?
That what you work for, the fruits of your labor is yours.
Okay. What does that mean?
That means if I make a mud pie, it's mine.
Okay.
If I have a chunk of land and I work the land and I build on it, that is mine. If I build a good business that has a great business model and it's very prosperous and it earns profits, it's mine. It's not for the government to take, which a lot of command governments want to do. And so it's recognizing that the world is better off when I produce and generate $1 and not worse off.
Okay. So understood.
Okay.
From a functional standpoint, are you considering taxation as seizure of property?
Taxation?
Yeah, because I'm trying to...
I've seen the buttons. Taxation is theft. And in a lot of ways it is. We have agreed to a minimal amount of taxation in America. Even in our Constitution, it allowed the federal government to be funded through duties and tariffs. And that seemed like a great thing. It seemed like it limited government until Woodrow Wilson comes around and decides, you know what? Hey, a federal income tax would be cool. The first federal income tax was at 1 or 2%. I think the top rate was 7%, but within 8 years had the top rate up over 70%. When government sees a source of seizing power and control and a budget, they'll take it.
Okay, so then from a functional standpoint, you're saying that there are aspects of our current government functionings that remove ownership of property to some, because when you're saying like, I want to be able to own property, it's like, yeah, I own a house. Like, what do I not own the house? Or is it, well, as long as you pay property tax, you don't actually own that house, which I've heard that argument, obviously. Or look, you want to build a business? Like, I've had a business before, like, and I paid taxes on that business. And I've heard the articulation that it's like, well, you know, if you're paying taxes on your business, you don't really own the business because you got that silent business partner. So when you're saying your priority is to make sure people own things and they own their property, is it a broader statement towards like, we shouldn't be drained, we shouldn't share in the profits of our business that we created within the system? Or are you literally saying like the government will come along, like I start a trash business and the government comes along and literally steals my trash truck and they're like, no, you no longer own this business, go away?
Yeah. Well, let me get to that by first pointing out that
I'm sorry, keep interrupting.
No, you're
Take
fine.
Your
no,
time.
The property was the first thing I mentioned. It's one of several important concepts. So because I mentioned it first doesn't make it the prominent one.
Sure.
Just so you know. But owning your own property is a fundamental right of man. It's something that didn't exist in the feudal state. It's something that doesn't exist in South American countries, which as soon as you build something productive, the state comes in and takes it. Property ownership of your household doesn't even work that well because in South America, if you don't own your property, you can't borrow against it to create a business. And I think it was Henry DeSoto in The Mystery of Capital pointed out that economic growth in South America suffers from it because if people can't own their property, they can't borrow against it, they can't build wealth. But America has property ownership. Now, I'm not saying zero taxation, because we do collectively decide that sometimes it's good to pool our resources.
Yes.
You know, if we had 10 houses in the middle of nowhere and we were worried about posses coming in and pillaging our community, we might agree to hire a sheriff collectively to protect our community there. And once you've hired the sheriff through a collective decision, you've created government. Right. But we've all decided we're going to contribute equally to that. We've decided, quote unquote, to tax ourselves for it. And so there's absolute limitations on what the government should do. We need to recognize, though, that whenever they impose a tax, they are taking property. Whenever they increase a zoning restriction, they are taking property through regulation. And so recognizing that, we want to limit that government footprint as much as possible. And we want to limit the coercion that we put on our neighbors by saying, I want this, therefore you should help pay for it. We don't always agree on that sort of thing.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm sorry I didn't get it
initially,
but like we got there. Okay, so property ownership. We want to have property ownership that cannot be that will be infringed upon or affected by government as little as possible.
As little as possible, and I think that our default should be lower taxes, lower regulations, rather than saying, "Hey, something good comes from this." One of the most frustrating phrases I hear from politicians and government officials is, "This is a good investment." A good public investment, because every dollar we put into this brings back $7 of economic growth. First of all, I don't trust the numbers. And second of all, government's not in the business of investment. Government's in the business of providing those very restricted, limited public goods that we want them to provide and nothing else.
What about things like we had the Ada County jail bond recently, like I think it was a year ago, it's 23 or something like that.
Sure.
They ran it and we have to make an investment. Okay. We don't have to, because we obviously it didn't pass. Okay. To be very clear, it lost by like under 1% or something.
Sure.
And the jail is still functioning. So to say we have to do it is totally not true. But the idea that I was hearing from my friends that work in corrections, and then obviously Sheriff Clifford and some other people, is essentially, okay, look, the more we push our existing budget and the stresses we have on it, the more risk we put our corrections officers in. And in fact, the whole concept of innocent until proven guilty. It's like you can be arrested and sent to jail. That doesn't mean you're de facto guilty, right? So you could be theoretically putting an innocent man through, worse and worse situations in a jail facility because it's overcrowded.
True.
So the idea that we needed to invest in our jail system to improve the situation and working conditions for the correctional officers, and in fact, just improve the system for, improve the judicial system, right? Because you're going through the court system. That seemed, again, I don't know if anybody called that an investment directly, but that's the kind of thing where I hear about people like, well, we need to invest in our corrections facility because of X, Y, and Z. But like, do you not view that as an investment category?
Well, I view by and large that those arguments had by the very public officials that are going to use them, build them, and dare I use the word profit from them, they have every incentive in the world to overstate benefits, understate costs, so that they can get more from the public for the things that they desire that are important to them and their own government industry. And so we have to be very careful about, are we getting the correct information? Like you said, it didn't pass, and government didn't die. They're still able to accomplish their mission. And, I was in the legislature, and ISP wanted Idaho to buy a helicopter and have 2 full-time pilots and have maintenance for it and everything like that. And so you have to look at that and go, well, here's the cost. What is the benefit of this? Does Idaho State Police really need a helicopter to help enforce everything they do? In terms of fighting fires and stuff, sometimes they rented helicopters from Oregon or from other places. And so there's other ways to approach your problem, but is the cost worth it? Gosh, I didn't see that. I voted against it. And you know what? It didn't pass, and I don't think it was a good plan. And so I guess it's healthy to have those debates, but I think what is better is for maybe in Ada County and those who want to expand their prison to be better off to define what minimal prison expenses should be, minimal prison facilities should look like. Government should not be extravagant. Government should be, in the military, when they say military grade,
yeah,
it doesn't mean it's over the top. It means the smallest possible piece or the least fanciest piece of equipment to get the job done. That's what military grade means.
Sure.
And back in the 70s, if you looked at a police car for a Los Angeles policeman,
push this out just a little bit. I'm losing you there. Okay. Perfect.
If you looked at a police car in, say, Los Angeles, the police officers, they aren't in a souped up car. They're in a sedan with a radio. It's the most basic model of car that you could have. But today, somehow, we feel like we need to have over-the-top sports car, over-the-top reinforced, top-of-the-line technology and everything that I think we've lost sight on what a limited government looks like, instead of saying, and instead have erred on the side, we need to fully equip, fully shower money on this so that the job of being police officer is as easy as possible. Now, I don't say that to denigrate police officers, but we used to view public service as public service, not public excess. And right now, when we have police units with MRAPs and over-the-top, military grade stuff and top-of-the-line equipment everywhere, you'd have to ask: Are we funding a common good, or are we funding a police/military industry to protect us?
I have not heard that concern. Is that something that you see? I mean, obviously you're an Ada County resident. Do you see that kind of extravagance popping up in the area?
We do a pork report every year, and one of those is we spent $72,000 on Mustang automobiles for $72,000 each for 9 new state trooper cars, which are really just souped up Mustangs, and yeah, they're over the top. I would call it government waste. I would say that we could get the job done, and we could maybe even be more efficient at it and get more of the job done if we had maybe more cars and with fewer bells and whistles.
What was the purpose of those Mustangs? The reason I ask is because when you talk about like a souped up car, I remember this dumb, like, I used to watch a lot of TV when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing this, it was like this documentary on the Miami drug runners, and the people charged, like the DEA had these speedboats that were like gangster speedboats. And it was like, the drug runners would get a speedboat, and then the DEA would get a better speedboat, and the drug runners would get a better speedboat, and then the DEA would get a helicopter, and then the drug runners got a submarine, and it was just an escalation. And it was like, wow, that's crazy that this is what's going on. Now, again, these people are running, millions and millions of dollars of drugs that kill people and are engaged in the drug trade. And that's bad. And they'll kill you if you get in their way. Like, great. Like, I'm not fighting against that. But when you say like, hey, the ISB got some Mustangs, it's like, I go into my head, I'm like, there's not a lot of room in a Mustang to throw like a perp. So like, that's not functional the way, say, like an Explorer or something would be. So what's the function of the Mustang? Because if it's a souped up Mustang, is it that like they needed interceptors throughout the state to catch? I mean, because this is not like a just driving around. Like, I've never seen one. I'm not saying they don't exist, but like, I've never seen one. So it's like, in what manner are they using these vehicles?
Yeah. I mean, it's ISP. So they obviously will make the argument they want the interceptor engine in every single one of them. And it has to be able to outdo the gangster car on the road too, right? And, there's different ways to skin a cat. It's not all just enforcement. Penalties can be an effective tool as well. More officers and more cars rather than fewer hyped up cars. Now, there's lots of ways to attack that.
The deterrent, right? That this seems to always have been, it's like, well, just make it worse. Like, I'm not saying we should go to capital punishment, like, where's that, Singapore? Like, if you're a drug person in Singapore, you get killed.
Back in the day, Michael Fahey getting caned for some sort of minor offense. Yeah.
It was so bad. If that was... Anyway, so it was, and I don't know, I genuinely don't know this answer. What was IFF's position on there? We had the fentanyl bill in 2024, right? Which made it did a lot of things, but we got mandatory minimums for fentanyl trafficking. We also got, if you were a drug dealer or trafficker and somebody took the product that you sold them and died, then you could get charged with murder. I think that was Representative Hill who brought that. What was like, is that the kind of deterrent that IFF likes, which is like, let's make this really painful for people that do drugs here? Like, was that something that you guys were in favor of?
Illegal activity ought to be punished, and sure, and the severity of the crime ought to match the punishment ought to match the severity of the crime. We have a problem with the mandatory there on that because it takes away discretion from the judicial branch that we've gone to great care to hire judges with discernment and judgment to make those decisions. So when you have mandatory minimums, unfortunately, you catch people in a net that you didn't intend to catch. And that fentanyl bill had that problem. It also had other problems with, we're going to define intent, not based on what you were thinking about doing it, but the number of pills you had tells you the intent. And that just doesn't square with common sense. And so there were some problems with that bill, but overall, the intent of the bill was good. It got plus marks on trying to tackle the drug problem and protect kids and protect society, but it got minuses for going over the line in terms of mandatory, getting in the way of that. And so I'm happy to take criticism on when people think that we're being too harsh on a bill or too soft on a bill. We'll take that. But the fentanyl bill, for whatever legislators have a problem with that, in terms of their index score, that was one bill out of 350 or so bills. And
sure.
Yeah. But, to your point that, there are lots of ways to tackle a problem. When I taught law and economics at the university level, we would talk about if you want people, if you think speeding is a problem on the highways because it leads to accidents and deaths, then there are ways to tackle that. You can tackle it through enforcement, or you can tackle it through higher fines. You can tackle it through higher conviction rates too, because a lot of people are let off of their speeding thing for being the first offense or whatever, and they go and appeal to the judge. And so you don't just have one way of doing it. And so the expensive way, the growing government way, is let's get more officers and more police cars. And if you put an officer at every mile, you're going to stop speeding, right? But that is impractical from a cost perspective. Another way to do it is increase fines and have fewer officers and fewer cars. But when you get caught, it's really painful for you. And so you're going to speed less on the chance that you happen to be in that caught spot. So there's lots of ways to tackle it. And the Freedom Foundation is, when we look at this, we want to have government be as least intrusive as possible and do things at the least cost possible, and consider efficiency and getting it right rather than just always looking to grow government to solve a problem. Unfortunately, those involved in the legislature and in the government agencies see growing government as the answer to every problem.
Well, not everybody involved in the government agencies.
True, not everybody, but
right. Like I'm sure some people
by and large, what we've seen is the growth in Idaho government has been outrageous. And so, yeah, the voices of those being more efficient have been drowned out by the voices of those who want big government, more government.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, you have a growing, let's say, housing industry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like more houses being built, housing affordability is a real problem. Fine. And that means that you most likely will have more housing permits, more planning and zoning to do. So it's like there's a certain degree of growth that Idaho's experienced that you would assume comes in parallel with a growing government just because of the just functions and operations required to continue the appropriate support of that growth.
Well, sure. I mean, you can't have a state policed by one sheriff. We get that.
Sure.
But when government is growing at 55% over 5 years, that far outpaced population growth and it outpaced inflation, and the combination of those two.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I took calculus when I was in high school, and I don't recall my teacher's name. I didn't care for him much, and I don't think he liked me either, but I took the class and I passed it. I very much enjoyed calculus. And he had this just snarky, about him. It drove me nuts. I'm like, dude, can you just chill? I'm like, come on, man. Anyway, so he had, hang with me here for a second though. So
let's go.
He would get up with this back when we had chalkboards, right? Not the dry erase boards. And he would get up and he would open a new pack of chalk, if it's chalk. And if it broke, he would throw the entire thing away. He wouldn't just like chalk up on the back and then use the remaining portion. He'd throw the whole thing away. And we're like, what are you doing, man? And I remember him telling me, he's like, well, Mount Diablo School District, the school district I was in, it was one of the worst in the state of California. Mount Diablo School District has an express policy that we are to accept the cheapest bid for everything we need. So Mount Diablo School District bought the cheapest chalk, and over half of them break every single time, and they're trash, and I throw them away. And then, like I open up another pack and I, use the 50% that work, whatever. And he said, because really what is happening is because they bought the cheapest thing, it leads to an overall increase in cost because the functionality of the trash they bought, it's like they break all the time. So how do we find that balance? His argument, of course, and I'm not saying he was right or wrong, but his argument was if they had just spent 10% more, they would have got chalk that lasted twice as long. So that 10% investment would have ended up saving money for the district. Now, again, he was a jerk. I don't know what his deal was. He was cranky, and maybe it was just me because I was an idiot 17-year-old too, I admit. But that's always something that stuck with me. And it's like, okay, if your goal is to save money, the answer is not always to purchase the cheapest thing. Do you think that should have a place in consideration in the Idaho legislature?
Oh, absolutely. There's a trade-off between cost and quality. Absolutely. I mean, as an economist, I get that. I get that in my own personal purchases. Do I always buy the cheapest thing? No, because I know that sometimes the quality, oftentimes the quality is higher when you spend more and it lasts longer.
So how do we articulate investing then a slightly larger amount of money to save money when we don't like the concept of investment in government?
Well, we do things. That's why it's good to have a watchdog organization. And we're not always saying do the cheapest thing.
Sure.
But we are saying get the job done in the most efficient way possible. When we put out a pork report exposing government waste, it does highlight the Ford Mustangs. We think the job could have been done a lot cheaper. But when you have an Idaho State Police that goes to conferences and sees the state of the art in state policing automobiles, and they think they want some, that's no longer merely serving the public interest. It's also serving the agency's interest in that. And we want to look like one of those cool state police things. And it sounds like I'm attributing a lot of motives to them. I don't know what their thinking was, but I think you can objectively look at it and say, we don't need a fleet of brand new fancy Mustang automobiles to get the job done in Idaho.
Well, I would love to know what it was too. If anybody from ISP is listening, like I'd love to chat to the, fleet manager and just understand like what, because again, that to me, like I don't know anything about Mustangs and I certainly don't know anything about law enforcement. So when you're like, hey, they bought 9 Mustangs, I say cool. And then you say 4 ISP, I say not cool. And then they're like, but we need them for drug people. I say cool. It's like, well, we don't need that many. Not like, I don't know anything about it. So like, maybe that makes sense. What else was on the pork report? Now you have me curious.
Coeur d'Alene hired a poet.
How do you mean?
They hired a poet. They have on staff a poet. I don't know.
Wait, like a full time with benefits and dental and everything?
I think it was like $6,000 a year or something like that. It's just Ada County Highway District spent nearly $200,000 wrapping their thehicles in Ada County Highway District advertising for their agency. Why does a government agency need to advertise itself?
I heard, and I cannot confirm this, but I heard this from Rebecca Arnold, who's the Ada County assessor, and she was running for ACHD commissioner against Pickering.
I don't know.
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Against the gal who's currently on ACHD. And Rebecca Arnold did not win. But she was saying that they spent, ACHD spent an exorbitant amount of money to rebrand and get like a new logo.
They did. That was part of it. Yeah. And not only that, they spent a lot of money on swag, on mugs, on T-shirts, on keychains.
What's wrong with swag, Ron? Come on now. I got a hoodie with a large on it just for you.
Idaho Freedom Foundation produces its own swag.
Why didn't you bring me? I have a hoodie for you, Ron. Where's my hoodie?
I'll bring you a mug.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great.
I love mugs.
Do we need government agencies to produce swag to advertise their own government agencies? We're hiring them to do a job at the least cost possible to get the job done well. And when they're spending money on things like swag, are we really serving the public interest, or are they just advertising their agency because it feels good?
Man,
I'm tough.
This is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you go through your rating process, do you have like a team of people who sit down and they
absolutely.
argue? They're like, okay, so look, what about, because when you say, hey, look, let's look at the fentanyl. All right. We don't like mandatory minimums. There is precedent in our legal system for mandatory minimums, but we don't think it sounds like you were saying, we don't think adding more of them is an appropriate thing. We need to trust the discretion of our judicial system. Okay. Mm-hmm. So when you sit down and they're like, okay, well, we're going to give it a plus for being better for kids and better for public safety. But how much of a plus? And we're going to give it a minus for adding the mandatory and taking away the discretion of the judges. Okay, so who determines how much plus and how much minus each of the offending or supporting principles gets?
We have a policy team, and every bill gets rated and looked at by at least 3 sets of eyes in that policy team. And yes, we do have those debates. And we have 14 metrics, and a bill can tick negative on one of those metrics 3 times by doing 3 different bad things in that one bill. And so they add up, and it's 1 point for each instance of it violating that metric. And so we try and keep it very objective, that if our policy-making team croaked, got hit by a bus, a new team comes in, we'd like to think that the objective measure would be applied the same and score the same. And so that's the way we've tried to construct it. Now, I want to step back half a step, if you don't mind, because it sounds like everything I've talked about is very cold-hearted, very calculating, very whatnot. But
you said you'd bring me a mug. That's very kind.
I know that, but the mandatory minimum thing, in principle, I think we've taken a very principled stance on it. But in practicality, it also has a very human consequence. I sat on the Judiciary and Rules Committee when a team, a Republican and a Democrat, teamed up on a bill to remove mandatory minimums for some of our minor drug crimes, including marijuana possession. We have a 3-strike rule, and it has a mandatory minimum with it. And I sat there for hours on this committee hearing heartbreaking stories, including a couple of parents who came in and talked about their kid who had made some mistakes. He had gotten 2 strikes against him, but the 3rd strike wasn't his fault. He was in a car with a bunch of friends. No, he didn't search the car to see what was in it before he got in it. And so they got pulled over for something. Police find this, and because he's in the car, possession counts. It's his 3rd strike. His college career ends as a sophomore. He's automatically in jail. I think the minimum for that was 10 years. That totally derails a kid's academic and career opportunities. And his parents are there explaining to us, there's a real human consequence to this. And it was heartbreaking to see. I'm a parent of 4 kids. I can totally imagine what it would feel like to see your kid caught up in that. Now, that's a mandatory minimum in practice. It sounds cold-hearted for me to say, hey, we shouldn't have mandatory minimums, -1 on that bill. But there's real human consequences to all of this. And all of our freedom principles, including every tax dollar that is earned by a household being taken by government for a purpose, we better make darn sure that purpose is good, because we're taking away the fruits of people's labor when we do that. Idaho Freedom Foundation has a job and a duty here to think about the forgotten man when government is loath to.
The mandatory minimum issue is complex, right? And as you're articulating, it's like, obviously it can run amok or run astray of what it was intended for. Here's something. It was explained to me that some of the people in favor of the mandatory minimum fentanyl bill were one saying, okay, look, if you make mandatory minimums, then that puts the ability to put pressure on the suspect to push up the chain of command within the drug community greater, because now the detectives are saying, hey, perp, here's the deal. You're going to help us and work with us. And if you don't, then we're going to throw the full volley, the full charge at you. And that judge is going to have to do the mandatory minimum because he has to. So the discretion and manipulation of the individual came down, well, not manipulation, but using that individual who's, obviously committed some crime, you get more value out of it from a detective standpoint. And that to me was like, oh, okay, again, I'm an idiot, but I was like, well, that makes sense, I guess, because obviously if you have a detective who's like, hey, if you work with us, we'll reduce your crime and you won't offend the mandatory minimum. If you don't work with us, we will charge you with a full crime and, you'll go away for a long time. Yeah. Do you think that that's an appropriate use of the policing system to have laws that enable detectives or law enforcement agents to decrease or increase, or have the standard charge volleyed against a suspect or decrease that based on participation and help with increased enforcement?
That's a great question. And that's looking at one side of it. And that's why prosecutors and the police were very adamant in testifying for this. But that doesn't, but what you're forgetting is defense attorneys testified against it. The judiciary, many of them were against it, but they didn't really come and testify because it doesn't really look right for judges to come in and testify for a law that they get to apply. You know what I mean? So it would look like a conflict of interest or very self-serving for them, but for some reason, not for the police and the prosecuting attorneys. Sure, absolutely. And they even testified to this, that it increases their ability to get higher penalties on the plea bargains that they get the defendants to accept because of the threat of the mandatory minimum. There's no doubt about that. The other side of that, though, is that as an economist, judicial discretion has a lot of value because the judge gets to decide, you know what, this is a borderline case. It shouldn't be at the top of the penalty thing. It should be at the very bottom. But if you take away that discretion, what are they left to do? Some judges were very heartbroken at having to put young college kids away for their 3rd strike because they had no other choice. But when you put in the mandatory minimum, you're telling judges that if you make this conviction, this is the sentence. Not that if you make a conviction, then you get to choose a variety of sentences. You're telling them what the sentence is. So therefore, what you've done is you've changed the judicial decision from a two-step thing, a conviction, and then a sentencing decision, to saying that your decision to convict is also the sentencing decision. You've combined the two into one, so they only have one degree of freedom here. And so what we find, and there's a lot of evidence that supports this, is when you have the mandatory minimums, conviction rates drop because judges know that mandatory minimum comes along with their conviction. So while you're trying to solve one problem, you're creating the incentive for judges to avoid those constraints by saying, you know what, I don't think this rises to the level of that sentence, but if I convict them, that's what they get. We're going to have a lower conviction rate from it. So on one hand, it'll increase the penalties through plea bargains. On the other hand, it'll decrease conviction rates. And by the way, decreasing conviction rates also decreases the potentialities there of plea bargains. If you have lower conviction rates, maybe the defendant rolls the dice more.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I had not considered that, but that makes perfect sense. The more, in fact, there was I had a conversation this last session about somebody had brought up capital punishment for, crimes against children, like, the really terrible things. And one of the arguments against having capital punishment in the case of, a child rape or something terrible, like heinous, right? One of the arguments against that was that victims, a lot of the times perpetrators communicate to the victims that you cannot tell anybody, say it's like a terrible uncle hurt, a nephew or a niece. You can't tell your mom or your dad because if you do, all go to jail. And that has a certain degree of efficacy with keeping a victim silent.
Yep.
Because the child, already a victim, is now considering being another victim of breaking up the family and, this is your fault that this happened to, your terrible uncle or whoever it might be. And the hesitation with the capital punishment in this case was that you're going to add a layer of severity to this, like 10 or 11 or 12-year-old child's decision, because the person will say, not only will I go to jail, I will get killed. So you can't tell anyone. So we would have a lower degree of reporting, a lower percentage of reporting crimes by, young people who are, have been harmed. The other thing, though, that I thought about with this is, okay, yeah, but you'd also have a much stronger deterrent. So although your rate of confession or whatever accusation might be lower, right, whatever percent that is, you'd also have fewer people that were willing to risk this, capital punishment crime. So it's like, where's the balance there? Because I think both things are true, at least from an economic standpoint.
There's a third thing true as well.
Third thing.
In economics, one of our basic lessons is to be aware of and consider all unintended consequences.
Sure.
So you have the intent, noble intent. We want to minimize the damage to kids. Noble. Nobody can argue with that. And what you pointed out is exactly true. You've changed the deterrent level. You've changed the coercion level that the person has on the kid.
The recidivism, the whole thing.
But how about this? Even worse is that if you have a mandatory minimum on that, and I'm just throwing this out as an economics thing. I'm not taking a position on this at all. But if the mandatory minimum is that you're killed for raping and abusing a kid, one of the ways you get caught is that kid telling their parents, telling somebody what you did to them.
They're not going to say anything if they're dead.
That's exactly right. You've just increased the incentive for that child rapist to also be a child murderer because it reduces their chances of being caught and therefore killed themselves.
This is a dirty business.
It is. Understanding all the impacts of what you do is very important. We've talked about some very serious instances here. most of what we're considering at the Idaho Freedom Foundation is not in the judicial, criminal justice.
Yeah, we went
area.
really
That's
dark
just
here.
I
don't know.
Yeah. You started this. You're
Can we
the one
get
where
back to
we're both
school
wearing
vouchers
black.
or something? Can we just
exactly? That's what I thought we were going to talk about. Now we're talking about ISP, and I'm going to have the whole state police
my
mad
gosh.
at me because I think they want fancy automobiles.
No, just have them. If they call, just be like, don't plead your case. I'm not a judge, but like, go just tell Matt. Like, I would love to know why those things are. Like, I don't know anything about law enforcement. Like, if the head of ISP comes in here, he's like, hey, Matt, let me go ahead and tell you why those Mustangs were reported. It's like, great, man. Like, I have no, like, awesome. Like, let's have it out.
That's right. Well, I'll tell you, at the Idaho Freedom Foundation, we have the Freedom and Family Agenda, which we're pursuing for this legislative session. And it's nothing to do with automobiles or police cars or all of that deep, dark stuff, but it's basically school choice. We spend a lot on education. I think since 2007, our budget's gone from just under $1 billion to $3.2 billion. It's tripled. Our student outcomes have stayed constant. Still, 32% of eighth graders are proficient at the eighth grade level in reading and math. It hasn't gone up. We've tripled the investment. We haven't tripled the population, but we've tripled the investment, so-called investment in education, and got nothing for it.
Every time you say that, I'm like, can he say investment?
There you go.
It's like it means different things in different situations,
It
right?
sure does. Yeah. But they keep saying we don't spend enough on education. And as we keep increasing our spending on education, the performance doesn't track with it. But, and then we have things like you have wokeness and DEI going on in schools. You have all these distractions. You have pride flags in some kids' rooms. You have gay straight alliance clubs on, at middle schools, even in Rexburg, Idaho. And you look at that and go, well, no wonder our education dollars aren't translating into great education because we have all of these other things going on. We can pass laws to end DEI and then they'll just change the name. We can pass laws on library books and on books in school libraries about what kids can read or not, and then they'll just change it or do something else instead. And but what really, passing laws is chasing our tail to try and get education to be good. Okay. What we need to do is introduce competition. Competition will drive parents to the best education opportunities for their kids. It will also improve public education because they will have to respond in kind to what parents are wanting.
Okay, hang on a second, because you just said a lot of things. Let's take this all apart.
Break it down.
It was my understanding that all of the LGBTQ clubs or whatever gay straight alliance clubs were private student run clubs within public schools. Now I could be wrong. I have no idea. Like I'm not. None of my affair. It's just my understanding. It's like, okay, these are not school led clubs where, in my former state, they had this. It was really unfortunate. They had this. There was some degree of school led and initiated, like from the administrators. And I have not seen that or heard of that being represented in the state of Idaho. It's like, no. If there's a club of that nature, then it's, a group of students got together, asked for a faculty sponsor or something like that, and they started the club. And that also has like a zero fiscal impact. So like, when you're saying like we've spent all this money and we haven't improved results, like that's not something that drains the Idaho's coffers, right?
That's a very innocent way of looking at it.
Tell me that
they have faculty sponsors. I'm
not saying it does for sure. That was just my understanding.
Yeah. But the legitimacy of these clubs comes from the school saying, yes, you can have that club. Comes from saying, yes, you need to have a faculty advisor or staff advisor for them. A lot of these clubs, a lot of them are advised or led by school counselors. And think about the school counseling industry. That is an industry. And when I was a kid, we had one part-time school nurse that served a lot of schools. Counselors were talking about what we're going to do in college and career. They weren't, mental health experts. But now, for some reason, we think schools should be the source of healthcare, mental health care, all this stuff, all this social activity, all the social stuff that goes on top of it. And that includes these clubs. And they're not run by disinterested adults. They're not advised by disinterested adults. It's usually an advocate pushing an ideology, and that's happening in our schools. I think that parents just want a choice. I'd rather not have my kids in a school that is pushing this or sponsoring a club that is allowed to push this and creating that narrative, even in the halls, about, hey, why don't you come to this club, or we're all in this club, and distracting all the kids on issues like this. Why not let me choose something else?
If my experience in Idaho public schools had been what you were describing, I would be 100% on board with everything you're saying. But that has not been my experience. I'm not saying it was not something that I saw in other states, but in Idaho, and I know this is a very large sentiment and concern for a large number of people that are predominantly consuming their worldview of public education from social media, because you don't have to spend more than 30 seconds on Instagram or TikTok to see like libs of TikTok or something like that. Yeah. And you see these insane,
I see what you're saying.
Insane. So it's like, I don't see that getting represented in Idaho public schools. I'm not saying it doesn't happen in the country. And you're saying, hey, look, consider the school counselor industry. I don't know anything about it. What I am saying is my experiences here have not been that way. That's not to say that we shouldn't have school choice. I don't know anything about it. What I am saying, though, is that from my experience in the public schools in the state of Idaho, multiple of them, it has not been a case where we have, people in the hallway trying to recruit individuals for LGBTQ clubs. And I'm not saying it has not happened anywhere. I personally haven't seen it. And if it is happening somewhere, it's like, where? Yeah. Who, like what school, what campus, what's happening?
Well, just go and search your school districts, search the school sites for GSAs or LGBT alliances, and you can see their presence there. They do have websites, and you can see that. But nonetheless,
bottom line is,
I don't have to be right on this.
Right.
I don't. The
school voucher question is an important one.
Yeah,
outside of the council.
If you don't think it's a problem, great, it's not a problem. If you don't think student performance is a problem, great, it's not a problem. And if you think that there are not those problems, then nobody should be threatened by school choice.
Well, here's a question then. Okay, first off, if I like performance, I'm a big quantitative guy. Yeah. Love the numbers.
Great.
How do I understand how schools actually match up in the private sector compared to public sector when, say, like the neighborhood public school that I have for elementary school, they have to take everybody that rolls up, and that includes everybody on all spectrums. And if you want to leave that school and go to, say, a private entity, you have to naturally apply. And for instance, I had a case where I was in, again, education when I was younger, SAT prep, working with a gal who was going to a private Catholic school, very nice private Catholic school. Turns out she was having seizures. Now, it was not the grand mal seizure where she'd fall on the ground, but she'd like zone out. Mm-hmm. And they realized, they're like, oh, you're going through like some kind of seizing process, where she'd go blank for like 45 seconds. Mm-hmm. The school that she had been in, the school system she'd been in since she was in kindergarten, essentially looked at her junior year and they're like, you got to leave. We don't have resources to deal with you. You need to go to the public school. They have resources. So she did, in fact, have to go to the public school. She did very well. She went on to a great college and is living a happy life and everything. But just recognizing that it's like, okay, if I, a parent, want to send and let's say I had, however much money was required, I want to send my kid to the best functioning school possible. I know what the numbers are for a public school. Mm-hmm. I don't have an analogous set of numbers to compare a private school. And I never will, as long as there's an admissions process and a path to kick out a kid from the private school in the absence of behavioral issues, right? Like that's just, how do I compare? So I want what you want. I want the best possible setup for my children. I'm a selfish individual like that. Absolutely. But how do we find out what that best is when we don't have analogous systems?
You want to go out to dinner tonight. How do you decide where to go?
I like ribeyes.
Then you go to the place that has the best ribeyes.
Great.
Yeah. How do you find that?
Taste.
Well, so you go taste all the restaurants?
Well, I taste all the ribeyes.
Yeah, but
I don't understand
to go to. How do you know which restaurant to go to?
Yes, but
do you look at Yelp? Do you look at ratings? Do you?
No, dude, I'm boring. I go to like one restaurant.
How'd you find that restaurant?
I drove by. I was like, there's a restaurant. Let's try it.
There you go. Maybe that's how you choose your private school.
That's a terrible way to assess best quality, though. If you're just driving by and you're like, there's a school, let's give it a shot.
It worked for you.
No, it didn't. That's not how I went to school.
No, it worked for you in ribeyes.
That's a terrible way to assess state level academics. But like, there's a restaurant. Let's try that.
Well, you're an oddball in terms of your menu.
What do
choices.
you like?
So let me bring.
Are you a New York guy? Are you a New York guy?
No. Let me give you an analogy. Should I do this?
I would love it, please.
I'll give you two analogies. Okay. Number one is that imagine 150 years ago that someone in government, some do-gooder, I'll give them that, noble intention, said, you know what? Gosh, not everyone has the best shoes possible. You know, some people are going without shoes. Some people are making, flip-flops themselves because shoes. I'm worried about shoes. Everyone should have a decent pair of shoes. And so what we'll do is we'll create a tax, everyone, and we'll create government shoe. And everyone will get their government pair of shoes, their free shoes every year from government. Boom, you go and get your government shoe. And it'll all be paid for from taxes. Now, that's great and everything. Over time, 150 years later, what do you think that government shoe looks like?
Something that goes on your foot.
Something goes on your foot. Do you think it would have pumps like Reeboks did a while back? Do you think it'll have air soles? Do you think it'll be arched like the Hokas?
LA Gear. LA Gear.
Do you think it'll look like that? What do you think government shoe looks like?
I don't know,
Do you think they'll do cross-training shoes and basketball shoes, or is it just going to be government shoe?
I don't know.
Now,
I'm so curious.
I know, but we didn't do the government shoe thing, and we can see what resulted from having private shoe. And you know what? Well, we have all sorts of shoe companies trying to do everything to attract my attention, to get me to buy their shoes. They're trying to make them perfect for cross training. They're trying to make them perfect shoes. They're trying to make them happy shoes for me. They're trying to make me happy as a shoe consumer to draw my business. But government doesn't have to do that. You would have government shoe, which is just a plain brown Oxford everyone wears, and that's it, because they didn't need to do it. Now, government didn't take over the shoe industry, so we see what became of it. I have no idea what education would have looked like today if government never got involved with it. I do know what happened to the shoe industry. I do know what happened to fast food. All these things that were driven by competition have driven us to business models that are trying their very best to make me as a consumer as happy as possible, provide me the best food, the best shoes at the lowest cost possible. Because if they don't do it, some other company will. I wish schools operated that way. I have no idea what schools would have done to make education better and cheaper than it is today because it's run by government industry. Bowling alleys. At some point, bowling alleys got rid of overhead projectors. You used to keep your score on an overhead projector, it would shine on the screen.
Yeah.
They went to TVs so you could see your scores. It took 30 years before public education got rid of overhead projectors. Okay. Bowling alleys were way ahead of schools on this. Schools are notoriously behind in technology, behind in innovation, behind in performance, because they don't face the competitive challenges that ordinary businesses do.
Here's something interesting for you.
Okay.
And I appreciate the bowling alley. I'm with you here.
There you go.
I was actually bowling champion of my high school. We won the league by 3 pins. It was literally our collective scores. It was astronomical. It's like in the thousands and it was 3 pins. Anyway, my point is,
score on a chalkboard or overhead?
I think, no, I was public school. It was paper, baby. Like, it was lame.
That's awesome.
It was lame. God, I was there. I had a good,
Sorry.
No, it's all right. We were talking about bowling and we were talking about overhead. Oh, here it is. Here's something that I find very interesting. In the 90s, I was going to school in the 90s. I started elementary school in the 80s. And I remember at my elementary school, which was a trash elementary school in Northern California, my high school actually ranked worse than the worst high schools in Compton. And it was in Northern California. It was terrible. Anyway, so my elementary school, we had a little computer lab, right? And it had like a CD-ROM. And I always remember because we like flipped out when you hit the button and you put the little CD in it and stuff. We had, Encyclopedia Britannica when that was a thing.
Sure.
And then as I went through middle school, we had a computer lab. Miss Gilman was my computer teacher. And man, she was different. She had tattooed on makeup. She had like a giant Marge Simpson beehive haircut. But she, and we had this whole room filled with those original like suitcase MacBooks with a tiny screen on it. And we would engage in, like projects. I remember doing like this PowerPoint in 8th grade. And I would go home. I had a computer at home too. And use 3D Studio and like did all these 3D designs and stuff. Anyway, moving through, go through high school. We have a computer lab there as well. I take calculus, like I'm in physics. I take all of the good classes, you know, by anybody's academic standards. And it was always the wealthier kids that had more access to computers, because we had like a school computer room that you would like go and get time in, or you could go use computers. Bill Clinton came to my high school. When it was like the year before I went there, they set up a computer lab, and part of his bid to get reelected in 96 was like meeting the people. So he came to Concord, California, and like, you know, was, you know, in the computer. There's like a shot online. It's hilarious. My point is, that has reversed, because the allure that we had towards inserting more technology into public schools, I think, has led us to a point where now we have these hammers, because they're like, more tech, we need more tech.
Absolutely.
We have all these hammers, and now the schools that are very, very expensive are schools that are no tech schools. Like, you want to go to the Waldorf school, no tech, we'll treat your kid like, well, it's really expensive. So I say all of this because I think there's an idea that education inherently has to keep improving and costing more and using more technology.
True.
When in reality, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. So when you're like, our schools are behind in tech, it's like, well, maybe that's by design. Maybe that's not a terrible, like a couple of my kids right now go to a charter school, and it's a no tech charter school. Yeah. And I could not be happier.
Well, understand that the bowling alley analogy was an analogy in that they are slow to innovate, and it's not just tech. They're slow to perfect their craft. You know, right now classical schools are the thing, because that's what's been left behind in public schools. If public schools were sensitive to what parents want, they would be providing that themselves, but they're not. They're sensitive to what big education wants. And you know, before we were on air, you were talking about sending kids home with Chromebooks and stuff.
Yeah.
That's not what parents want. Parents want their kids to be able to read, write, and do math. They don't care about the technology. They don't care about the wokeness. They don't care about anything else. They want their kids to be able to be prepared to go and think smart, think rationally, make good decisions, and be productive in society.
Ron, listen to me.
Yeah.
We've been talking for well over an hour. I feel like we are barely scratching the surface. I don't want to keep you all day here. I know it's a working day.
I've got 5 other principles that we're working on the Idaho Freedom Foundation.
Can we do this again and
absolutely
keep hitting them? Because again, like just this one initial thing, like led us down this rabbit trail. We're not gonna rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Trail? Why did I say trail?
I've heard both. I've heard both.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. Thanks for that support. Let's do this. Let's cap the episode now so we don't kill people with information. Let's do it again.
Sure.
Please. Let's keep digging into this stuff. Obviously, the legislative session is coming up. That'll be awesome. I actually have a studio downtown. I was telling David Ripley and a couple other people, I have a studio downtown so I'll be 2 blocks away from the Capitol. So we'll be able to talk about, have people talk about why they're voting or what the bills are. And, I'd love to have you come back and we can chat about stuff that you think is priority or should get axed, or like if somebody gets a -6, we can talk about the -6. I'd love to understand more about the rating too, right? Because I understand the final rating number. Yeah. Do you guys give breakdowns of like, okay, we arrived at a -6 because I gave you on these 14 principles, I gave you like, this is the breakdown where it's like, you got a -2 here, and then you got another -2 here. You got a +5 there, but man, that was a -3. Like, do you give that level of breakdown?
Every bill that's rated has the analysis written up. So you can go and see where every negative, where every plus came from. A paragraph written on each gets a -1 because it violates the constitutional principle of, free speech or something like that.
Gotcha.
So we do that. And I'd like to have a broader conversation on conservatism too. I want to dispel this notion that a liberty organization or a freedom organization is simply about no government or anarchy or doesn't care about people. When people ask me why I'm a conservative, it's because I care about people. And that I know that just expanding government or looking at government to solve every problem diminishes the community, diminishes the individual. That when you try and solve a problem with government, you eliminate the incentive for the person to help themselves, for the family to help the person, for the churches to help the person, for the community to help the person, and you've turned it over to government, who is notorious for not caring about people.
Well, listen, let's have that conversation.
Let's do it.
I appreciate it. Thank you
All
for
right.
coming in today. I recognize it's a work day, but next time I'll line up as much time as we need and we can just start banging these things out. It'll be great.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, sir.